If you like this podcast or the previous ones, please consider buying me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Frankie'sPod. It just goes to help fund the software and the hosting. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. Tonight, I've got the honour of speaking to Dave Saben. Now, Dave was a platoon commander in Delta Company, 6th Royal Australian Regiment, and served in Vietnam, and was mentioned in dispatches. Most notably, the reason I've got him on the podcast is to talk about the Battle of Long Tan, which has been an ex-gunner. It's quite famous in the artillery for the use of artillery to pin the enemy down, let's say, but we'll talk about that more later on. Hello, Dave. How are you doing?
Hi, Frankie. Very well, thank you.
Right. Again, like I said to everyone to come on, thanks so much for coming on and agreeing to do this. And I know there's a massive time difference with us. It's like 9 o'clock at night over here, 9:30 at night nearly. And you're just getting ready to start your day. So, you know, and I imagine the weather over there is a lot better than it is here.
Wonderful. T-shirt.
Yeah, it's not here, put it that way. Right, so if we just want to start off, it's normally like the usual 5 questions that I ask. Is where did you grow up? Why did you join the army? What was it like? Why did you leave? And what have you done since? And I mean, I think that format's going to change as we go along. But we'll start off with there. If you can just give us a bit of background about yourself, where did you grow up, and why did you join the military?
Okay. Well, I started off in Fiji. I was born in Fiji, which was back in 1945 a British colony. My dad was also Fiji-born, but ultimately from British stock, having come in with the Royal Navy in the 1800s. So he joined the British Colonial Customs Service, and so I spent my first 9 years in Fiji, growing up as a kid, before he was transferred to another British colony, which was British Honduras, Central America, now Belize. So the family moved there for a few years, and then another transfer to Mauritius, which again was under British, that was from the Napoleonic Wars. The British took it as part of the Napoleonic War reparations. But by that time I was 13, coming on 14, and Mauritius was French-speaking, and the standard of education wasn't terrific. So I was shipped off to relatives in Australia for my high school years. So then at 13, coming on 14, I went into high school boarding school in Sydney, and I did my high schooling through there. I had come in on my mother's passport, so I was, to all intents and purposes, an undocumented migrant. But I just stayed on. I left high school and joined the workforce. So I was still a British citizen, a British subject, Fiji citizen, and in the workforce. In 65 or early 60s, Australia was having trouble with Sukarno in Indonesia, and they vastly outnumbered us. We had not many infantry battalions, so it was decided that we'd have to boost our army. So they introduced a national service scheme. It was actually the second scheme that we had, because we had one for Korea earlier. So the first intake of that national service scheme came in mid-65, and it selectively called up by birth date males turning 20 years old per 6-month period. And they were put through an intensive qualification, medical, psychological, and drafted into the army for 2 years. And so I was in the first intake of that. So that's what put me into the army. Part of the of the scheme was that if you qualified, which in those days was the fifth-year high school leaving certificate, we used to call it. If you'd had your leaving certificate, you could qualify to volunteer for officer training for a very much reduced course that was aimed specifically at making an infantry platoon commander capable of commanding an infantry platoon in a Southeast Asia jungle-type environment for conventional warfare. So it was a very limited commission.
Yeah.
So the first 6 months of my 2 years was that course, from which I graduated. December 65, posted to an infantry battalion, a newly formed infantry battalion. Within 3 months, or I think 3 months of joining, we were warned to go to Vietnam. And I mentioned that the reason for the national service was to build the army for a deterrent to Sukarno in Indonesia. But in the interim, from the early 60s until the mid 60s, the accent started to drift from Indonesia, who backed away from confrontation, and the Vietnam War was beginning to crank up. And the Americans were starting to put troops in there starting in 65. And we now had an increased capacity. So we held hands and joined in the Vietnam War. We had an infantry battalion, which was one RAR, operating with the Americans from mid-65 to mid-66. But it was operating with the Americans at Bien Hoa base. And one way or another, we were asked to increase our contribution. And Australia basically said, well, yes, we're prepared to send more troops, but we don't want to work with the Americans because we're not on that scale of operations. They are a huge operation, doing big, sweeps. We were a small operation doing lurking in the jungle tricks, smaller scale operations. And we had
you had learned a lot of that in places like Malaya. And
we had worked with the British in the Malayan emergency, and in Borneo, and we had established a good reputation there as jungle fighters or low-level operations, counter-revolutionary warfare, if you like, rather than conventional warfare. So on that basis, yes, we would contribute more troops to Vietnam, but please give us our own area of operation, something significant, something where we could use our own skills. And although we can call on Americans, that we can handle by ourselves, by and large. So we were given a province that we could operate in. And starting mid-66, we built our forces, first of all, to 2 battalions under what we called a task force, which was a reduced brigade. And then later, a year or two later, we put a 3rd battalion in there, so we became a brigade with attached armor and artillery and so on. After being warned for Vietnam, which was essentially the same training that we were doing anyway, we went into training for Vietnam for the April, May, June of 66, and found ourselves in Vietnam in June 66 in a brand new province, untouched by allies, and even the French and the Japanese hadn't been into this province. Apart from off the roads, apart from on the roads, I mean. So we were given basically a virgin province and told to bring it under control. That was
so. What was when you got warned that you were going to go to Vietnam? What was the reaction of people? I mean,
pretty keen.
Did you just kind of know this was going to happen, or?
Well, we didn't expect Vietnam. We were raised and trained really to resist a potential invasion in North Australia, Northern Territory of Australia, anticipating that that's where the Indonesians would operate if they did anything. The concept was maybe they would land in the north of Australia in force and basically sit there and say, well, if you want to kick us out, come and try. But before then, it might have had a go at Irian Jaya, western part of New Guinea, which was a protectorate of Australia. So we were anticipating counter-revolutionary insurgency operations in a jungle environment or heavy bush environment. So that was what we were trained for. And when we were given the option of going to Vietnam, the government said, well, we've got troops that can do it. It's a limited operation. We're not getting into World War III. We'll use the troops that we've got now to fulfill that obligation. Because we were part of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which was a group of Southeast Asian nations pledged to come to each other's aid. And South Vietnamese was one, and we were another. So we were, by the international agreement, we were obliged to help if and how we could. So it was sort of, okay, well, we're here, we're trained. This fulfills part of our government's responsibility. We'll go. But engendered in the national service scheme was, you're in the army, you better learn how to do it, and you don't have to enjoy it, but do it well.
Yeah.
So we were
got
keen
no choice.
to do it. Yeah, got no choice. And you go in glum, you'll come out glum. You go in, with a good attitude, you could do something useful. And we did a lot of good. History shows that we did pacify the province, which we.
What was it like being in? Was there any difference between the regular soldiers and national service soldiers? Because I've seen reports and that were
no.
It was told. I think. What was your colonel called? Was his name Smith? I think it was.
My company commander's name was Smith.
Yeah, I've seen a documentary where he mentions about it, that there was literally, you could initially, obviously there was going to be a little bit of, there was a little bit of difference in training, but straight away almost that was it. They were exactly the same.
Exactly the same.
The other.
Once you did recruit training, you simply joined as if you were a recruit, and you were treated and trained in exactly the same way. You couldn't, other than your regimental number, you couldn't tell the difference.
And there was no, how did the regular soldiers take to the national service soldiers? Was there any?
With obviously they were on edge. They were a bit nervous, particularly since the NCOs were obviously 20 plus, maybe 30, and they had to sort of look closely and squint their eyes when a 20-year-old came in and said, well, I'm the lieutenant here, you salute me and I'll tell you what to do. And there was probably gritted teeth and a lot of mumblings in the in the lines, but essentially the stiff upper lip, produced, and fortunately, within 6 months of operations, it was proven that we were every bit as good as anyone else. So we were accepted. Ultimately, the army, it just became indistinguishable. The 2-year blokes and it wasn't like the weekend chocolate soldiers, reserve forces. We were in there full time, and it was blood and guts and glory, just the same for them as for us.
So what was it like arriving in Vietnam for the first time then?
Well, it wasn't a problem to me individually, because I'd grown up in Fiji. I'd had British Honduras and Mauritius experience. I knew what the tropics were like. I could handle the heat and the humidity, the physical stuff. I was familiar with the third world environment, but a lot of the Australian people who were called up, too young to have gone to Malaya, for instance, had no experience, and world travel wasn't a big deal in those days. We weren't a very well-travelled population. So it came as a bit of a shock to see the conditions in which the peasants, if you like, the bulk of the Vietnamese community lived. The unsanitary conditions and pigs tied up to the supports under houses and drains not draining, that sort of stuff. So it was a bit of a culture shock for most people. But again, we didn't mix with the locals. We had to travel through their environment. But the Australian method of operations were that the South Vietnamese army would look after the population. They would control the villages and the roads, and we would be off the road. So it was early established that we didn't operate anything within 100 yards of any village or any road or bridge or anything. That was the province of the South Vietnamese army. So we had very limited contact with the locals on operations. If ever we had to go into a village or clear a village, it was always with South Vietnamese army there, because they knew the language, they knew the culture, and so on. And so we would cordon a village, for instance, but they would go in, typically.
So I suppose that keeps you away from the animosity of the civilian population as well.
Yes, that was part of it. We didn't involve ourselves with the politics. A lot of the South Vietnamese civilians were pro-government, and a lot were pro-VC, pro-communist. But that was sorted out amongst them. We didn't become involved in that. We did what the South Vietnamese government wanted us to do, which was almost entirely defensive. For instance, cordoning villages or forming blockades and so on. We had, in the early days, most of our contacts were having blockaded a village that the South Vietnamese were going to search. Then people that didn't want to be found in the village jumped the fence and ran away, and they ran into our forces. So it was interdicting their own, the enemy lines of communication. We caught a lot of couriers, for instance, tax gatherers, recruit people, political cadres, with and without weapons. But if they were in a designated bush area, we would apprehend them if we could, and if we couldn't, we'd shoot them. That was the rules of engagement that we worked under. This was the early days of non-conventional warfare, so that the rules were still being established. So it's not the same as what ended up happening in Iraq or Afghanistan. This was the early days. The next development after the Malayan emergency, if you like, where the number in Malaya, the emergency essentially involved very few what they call CTs. The number of CTs was very small, and so low-key operations handled that. In Vietnam was much more, particularly in the other provinces. Some provinces which the Americans operated in were essentially not controlled by the VC or the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, but going that way. And so the Americans in their large operations met a lot more resistance than we did. Ours was in the early days of the subversion, if you like, and the enemy in our province hadn't been challenged. Our province hadn't been operated in by the French during the French colonization, by the Japanese during the Second World War who took Vietnam, or by the Americans or the South Vietnamese.
Was there a reason for that? Was it so like isolated? Or
it was just it was of no major political significance. It was, but they dealt with it. In point of fact, the area that we were given contained the only deep water seaport that was able to supply Saigon. So because the Saigon is inland, upriver, and the Saigon River was subject to ambush and mines, therefore they couldn't bring ships up there. So for the first several years of the Second Vietnam War, if you like, Second Indochina War, the South Vietnamese didn't control the port of Vung Tau. It was 15 miles or so away from Saigon. So every time they needed a ship convoy coming in, the South Vietnamese army had to come in and secure the road down to the port, and then bring all the port stuff in, and in a series of convoys, convoy it back to Saigon, and then they'd pull back again. The communist forces, the NVA, weren't strong enough to resist them, so they had to let it happen. But it became a very expensive operation for the South.
I can imagine.
They didn't have the facilities to air supply Saigon. Saigon Cholon, which was a twin city, had I think 5 or 6 million people in those days. They just couldn't supply it. The road convoys were unreliable, subject to ambush and so on. There's not airlift. There was no airlift capacity, so it had to be sea supplied. And this port of Vung Tau was key to their survival, but it was very expensive to maintain. So slapping the Australians in there and saying, take command of the province and open the road to the port was strategically a vital job, more vital than actually going out and eliminating the forces. So the way we did it was we said, okay, well, we'll leave the towns and the roads and the bridges to the South Vietnamese, and we will set up our base in the bush on the perimeter of the populated area, and we will clear the province. We'll get rid of the threat for you while you upgrade the roads and the bridges and get your supplies moving. That was the strategic concept.
So what was the first type of patrols like for you?
Well, by the nature of our job, the first thing we had to do was to go into the bush and establish a base from nothing. So our people went in and decided that a certain hill nearby to the populated area was going to be our base. It was just a hill of rubber plantations around 3 sides of it. And in the Vietnamese language, Nui Dat is the name for a small hill. And all over the map, there were little Nui Dats, Nui Dats, Nui Dats. So we picked on one of them and said, okay, well, this Nui Dat is going to be ours. So capital N, capital D, Nui Dat became our base. And so initially, day one, we had to go in there, sit on this hill and for half a kilometre around it, and clear it, establish it, set up an elementary base, lay out a track system, get wire stores and put wires down, wire defences and so on. And in the process of clearing that, we then had to expand outwards. And infantry's job mainly was in small platoon-type patrols, going out 2,000 or 3,000 yards and clearing the vicinity. For the first month, 2 months, 3 months, our main job was securing the area. So notionally, around our base, we drew a line 5 kilometres around the base. 5 kilometres being good artillery range. We had 105 howitzers mainly. And also it was the assumed limit for the maximum range of the enemy's indirect fire weapons. So they didn't have artillery, but they had recoilless rifles and mortars.
Yeah.
And we assessed that the effective range for both of those was maybe 2,500 yards. So we drew a line 2,500 yards or 5,000 yards out from the base and called that line Alpha. And our first target was then to clear that area, to make sure the enemy couldn't come in and bombard us. And we didn't do patrols out beyond 5,000 yards because we were then running out of our own artillery cover. We had 3 batteries of 105s, 2 New Zealanders, 1 Australia, in the base. And we had a little bit later on, we had 6 155 self-propelled artillery American guns. If we operated beyond the 5,000 yard range, we would have to relocate one of the batteries to a fire support base. So let's say when we went beyond 5,000 yards, it was a company at a time rather than a platoon at a time. And so we would move a battery to a fire support base, which would take a company of infantry to protect. And then, of course, the company that it was being fired in support of. So it was very expensive for us to go beyond the 5,000 yards to start with. As towards the end of our first year there, we established a number of permanent fire support bases. One colloquially known as the Horseshoe was the main one. The Horseshoe being an eroded volcano, so it looked like a horseshoe, and within that we put 6 guns and a few platoons around the perimeter on the high ground, and that became a permanent fire support base. It was able to fire in support of the base, and the base was able to fire in support of it.
That's interesting. That, I mean, I didn't realise that you said that. That you were there when you built the base. I didn't realise that. I mean, someone's got to build it, yeah, obviously, but I didn't realise that you were there. I thought you had moved into it.
I mentioned from mid-65 to mid-66, we had one RAR, one battalion, operating with the Americans over in Bien Hoa province near the Saigon. But from then on, when we took over the base, that was mid-66. And yes, I was I was in one of the 2 battalions that came in there. Virgin bush. This is where we're going to set up our base. This is where our headquarters is going to be. This is where our latrines are. That's the front line over there, so we'll mow the grass. That was it. And
Wow.
as we could get stores, defensive stores, like wire, for instance, and pickets, as they came in, we planted them. But we protected the base by our saturation patrols of the nearby ground. Of course, the enemy was interested in what we were doing, and they were sending in recce patrols, 3 or 4 man patrols each night to establish where our perimeter was and try to draw fire, get our machine guns to fire. So it was very hectic on a very low scale, and essentially that push for the enemy to locate where we were over the first month or so, they could see by where they were being denied where we were. And obviously they went back to their bases and decided, well, the best thing we can do under the circumstances is go in and take out the base. And that led to the Battle of Long Tan, which was an anomaly because it only happened, I think, 72 days after we arrived. So we were hardly acclimatized, never mind familiar with everything. But suddenly,
you weren't what you'd call battle hardened.
Oh, not at all.
Yeah.
For most of the troops involved in the battle, this was their first firefight, including me. Yes, we'd had a couple of sniping jobs. People would come up to the wire and fired a few shots into the area that we were in, with the intention of them drawing our fire so they could mark where the machine guns were and so on.
Yeah.
But we were trained well enough to resist that. We'd had, I think, a couple of shoot and scoot on our patrols. Our patrols would go out and lurk around, and if we happened to trip something, they would fire and run away. So we'd come under some sporadic fire before, but certainly not combat.
So what was the day like? So the start of the battle. What do you remember of that?
What was the
day? The start of the battle. So if you talk about the day.
Yes, we turned up there. The first battalion to Nui Dat was 5 RAR, and they turned up in mid-May. 6th Battalion turned up in mid-June, so we're just starting the base there. July and the first part of August, 6 weeks of intensive patrolling, or 8 9 weeks for them. And we were getting familiar with the operations. Everything was overgrown. There was hardly any tracks in the bush. Nothing was cleared, for instance. And we knew that they were out there. We came across abandoned camps and so on. But there was nothing intense except the recce. We knew that we were being looked at. The first indication we had that they were going to actually do something was the very early hours of the morning of the 16th, 17th. We were mortared and recoilless rifled from 2,500 yards out. They showered us for half an hour with mortar and recoilless rifle shells. There was one artillery piece, a French cannon that was used, but for another reason, none of their shells exploded. They sent us the shells, but they didn't explode. However, that's beside the point. The very early morning of the 17th, that shelling took place. So the whole base stood to and expecting to see the massive hordes arrive, and they didn't. So the morning dawned, and we sent out one of the companies, Bravo Company of 6th Battalion, sent them out to locate the base plate firing positions of the enemy, with a view to assess how many there were and what, where they came from and so on. So that company went out, but essentially we were city boys, not trackers. We hadn't learned the details of tracking. So they were able to locate the base plate positions, the mortar base plate and the recoilless rifle base plate. But as they spread out and searched for the withdrawal tracks or the exit tracks, they lost them. So they couldn't really establish through the day of the 17th, they couldn't establish much more than, there were probably about 30 blokes all up, two teams of about 15, some to operate the equipment and some to defend them. So we came at the end of the afternoon to think, well, okay, there's been about 30 people out here with heavy weapons, but it's the end of the day and we can't do much about it now. And the people that were coming out had another job to do the next day. So they were told to stay out there, and a fresh company would go out and relieve them and take over and follow the tracks that they had found. And that replacement company was Delta Company of 6th Battalion. So late morning on the 18th, we went out to where the Bravo Company were, and they showed us the base plate positions. Our counter bombardment fire had been on target, so there was some debris around, and we had a couple of tracks to follow. But in that process, we found that there were bullock cart wheel ruts tracks leading back into the rubber plantation directly due east, whereas the foot tracks moved north-east into some heavy bush area, good ambush positions, and we were smart enough to realise that if we went there, it's an open invitation to ambush. Whereas the bullock carts obviously carried the heavy weapons. They were heavy, laid deep ruts in the ground. It was coming up to monsoon season, so the ground was pretty mushy. And it was into an open rubber plantation, which is hard to ambush because of the visibility. So we elected, it's been 36 hours since the bombardment. They've had a lot of time to leave. The bullet carts will be slower, so we'll follow them, and the side benefit of that is if we catch up with them, we'll get their heavy weapons. So just after lunch, then we moved eastward into the rubber plantation in pursuit of the bullet carts that supported the attack. And that was the start of the battle, being the night of the 17th, but it wasn't a battle. And then we, in our movement east, in through an open rubber plantation, so we were widely dispersed, two platoons up, big arrowhead formation. We covered about 400 yards width in our advance, And in that process, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we were in the process of crossing a road in the rubber plantation, and we had our first contact. And the first contact was the right-hand leading platoon was in the process of doing an obstacle crossing drill, which the infantry will tune to. Very slow and considered process. And in the process of them doing that, 6 NVA soldiers sauntered down the track with their rifles over their shoulders and smoking and chatting and talking and grouped together, so that they were obviously not expecting us, and sauntered into our area just at the wrong time, because the sergeant of 11 platoon was in the process. He was in the ditch ready to cross the road, and he saw them coming over the slight rise, so he let them come for 30 seconds, a minute, until he had a decent shot, and he opened fire on them. Hit 2, and the others picked up the body and ran, leaving a weapon behind. That was the first contact, about 3:15, 3:30 on the 18th of August. So that they were the first hot shots fired.
Yeah. I mean, bloody hell. I mean, bad timing for them to just walk into. Well, that's what you were there to do. That's, to find them. I'd imagine that they weren't the actual people who had attacked the base
No.
in the previous hours. So,
No.
When that came over the radio with the first contact and everything like that, did you know that only you wouldn't have really known what was going to come?
No, not at all.
From that, no.
We could work out afterwards what had happened, but at the time, of course, this was what we were looking for. We were looking for people that were out here. We anticipated maybe 30 of them. Why were they still in the area? Well, we don't know about that, but they are, so we're going to get stuck into them. The way it transpired, because the battle then developed after that, was that there's a whole group of people, like a couple of thousand people, further back into the rubber plantation to the east. And this, presumably, if they had done their doctrine like we do, a big group of people resting up, they'd send out clearing patrols. And this was a clearing patrol, just sweeping their front. But they'd probably done that all day on the 17th and all day on the 18th so far, and not seen anything. So they were pretty slack. As I said, rifles over the shoulders, smoking, talking. They were quite confident that if we were any reasonable soldiers, we would have followed the foot tracks, northeast into the bush. So we were too stupid to do that, so that we wouldn't be here. So they were quite confident that they were safe. The firing on them would have come as a big surprise, but again, the only experience they would have been either with the Americans up country or the South Vietnamese, and in both of their cases, they wouldn't have pursued in the same way that we did. So our reaction was, 11 platoon, you've had a contact. There's 30 of you. Go and find them and hold them, and we'll close up behind you, because we're a company of 108 people and we can handle 30. So chase them, follow them up, locate where they are, and call us in. So he detached 11 to do that job, and in the meantime brought the rest of the company across the road and formed them up, ready to go wherever 11 platoon told us to go. So it was a swift follow-up and an immediate reaction, which the enemy wouldn't have expected, not because they weren't used to Australian operating conditions, how we operated, and the Americans would have stepped back and thought, well, but we need a division here and a brigade over there, and it has to be mechanized, and call in Puff the Magic Dragon, and it would have been big. And the South Vietnamese would have been, well, I can't see them, so they're not there. We'll have a cup of tea and worry about it later. So
that's one way of doing it.
Yep. So their inexperience with us would have misdirected them as to what we would do about it. Our reaction time and our reaction aggression would have been unfamiliar to them.
And how long till they actually caught up with them?
Oh, okay. They pulled back. This little group of people, now carrying at least one dead and one badly wounded, withdrew to a small rubber plantation trapper's hut, a little ramshackle shed, and patched him up a couple of 100 yards back while we were getting ourselves organised. And by the time 11 platoon advanced following the tracks, because it wasn't raining yet, and there was a blood trail and a drag marks, and so they saw the hut up ahead. So within 15 minutes or so, they were putting in an assault on the shed, and found it empty, but had battle debris, dressings and so on in there. So they knew they were on the right track. In the time it took them to clear the shed, the enemy had fled further east, and again the tracks were still in the ground. So they then expanded out to extended line, so, to prevent the tracks leading into an ambush. So 11 platoon was essentially an extended line and moving forward eastwards fairly quickly. That was another 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so. Once they were on their way, they hit a very wide enemy formation who was lying on the ground, but not in pits. So they weren't expecting, it wasn't an ambush. They weren't expecting us to be there. But the fact that when they were sighted, they were shot at from 90-degree angles, said immediately, well, this is more than a platoon of 30 people can handle. We'll sit down and go in defense. They didn't have to radio to us because we were 300, 400 yards behind, and out of the blue, bullets started rattling through the trees, through the canopy overhead, and we could hear a massive burst of fire. And we knew just by the volume that there was going to be some trouble here. Even if it was only 30 people with several machine guns, it would take the whole company to handle it. So our initial reaction was, well, let's move forward to where we can and see what develops. In the meantime, 11 platoon, you sit down and fire back, and basically you hold them there, and we'll advance and find out a bit more about where the enemy is. And while we're doing that, we'll call in one of the batteries. Every time we went on patrol, we had one battery in direct support. That's 6 105 howitzers, and one on call, and one would have been operating in support of someone else. So those are the 3 artillery. So we had one in direct support, that is, meaning we can call it on at any time and get immediate fire. So we gave that to 11 platoon, who then called in artillery on the enemy that they could see. Now, the procedures in those days, and I don't think they've changed very much since, is you first call it. I'll give you some artillery speak now so that you can see what I'm talking about. First fall of shot is going to be 1,000 yards away for safety reasons. So, one round, fire, over the head, 1,000 yards away, you don't even hear it. You come back, shot fired, okay, shot over, drop 500. So, and that's a few minutes, and then the next thing, overhead, and a little tiny bang, 500 yards away through the rubber and the bush. You're still nowhere near where I want it. Drop 250. So it took maybe 10 or 15 minutes of argy-bargy, and eventually we got shots that we could hear, or the 11 platoon could hear, and from there they were able to say, okay, no, left 200, drop 100. And they started to get artillery on target. While that was happening, we moved forward to a position maybe, let's say, 300 yards behind, and were ready to, do we go ahead and support 11, or do we pull 11 back? And the answer was that in that time, 11 reported enemy starting to flank them, not with force, but with flanking patrols, 2, 3, 4 men coming around to the left and coming to the right, with the view of getting around behind us and seeing how big we were, because they didn't know how many we were. And if we had been an American outfit, we wouldn't operate in a company 5,000 yards away from base. They would have had a battalion there, and the South Vietnamese might have had a company there, but more likely they'd operate in bigger numbers. So they wouldn't have expected a unit as small as a company to be opposing them. So they needed to establish how many they were. And the idea that there was only 30 men actually facing them wouldn't have even occurred to them. They wouldn't have thought that it was possible for someone to be stupid enough to send 30 people out into the bush. So in that process, we realized that they were flanking them, and that if we went to where 11 platoon was, they would flank us too, because there didn't seem to be any shortage of firepower coming. They seemed to have a lot of firepower. They were shooting a lot, so there was obviously a big force there. It wasn't just a couple of people on a shoot and scoot patrol.
Mm-hmm.
So we decided the best thing we could do is to send 10 platoon around to the north and lay fire to the east of 11 platoon, and thereby extract 11 platoon, at least to form a company position. And so the next maneuver by the company was, 10 platoon, left hook around above them, lay fire on them, and 11 platoon can pull back. Good plan. 10 platoon had gone maybe 200 yards before they met exactly the same thing. They all across their front, they could see people moving, and they knew it wasn't Australians. So they fired on the enemy in front of them, which was advancing towards them, but with their eyes to their left, where 11
looking at
Their intention was to form up and sweep down to the south and eliminate 11. So there was essentially an impromptu ambush there, which 10 platoon initiated, and they got into a firefight, and they started to have the same thing. They were starting to see flanking movement and so on. And it was
so you were getting a better idea of the size of the opposing force then as well, because you just wouldn't have had an idea to start with.
Not to start with, but
No.
But within that period of time, we realised that there was at least double or a double company, because we'd started to count machine guns, and what was opposing 11 platoon was more than 3 machine guns, and so it was bigger than a company, or bigger than a platoon. It must have been a company, and 10 platoon reported the same thing. So we realised that we, a company, were being faced with at least 2 companies of enemy. So at that stage, it became, well, we're not going to be able to attack them. We need to defend. So our aim of the patrol to locate the enemy had now been established. We know where they are. They're coming to get us. So let's pull them back. 10 platoon failed to achieve that because they were under the same amount of fire. So 10 platoon, with a couple of other stories in amongst there, losing their radio and so on, eventually started to leapfrog back to company. But that still left 11 exposed. So 12 platoon was the third platoon. Delta Company comprised 10, 11, and 12. 11 we knew about, 10 we knew about, 12 was the only one he had left. So he said, 12, Dave, get your blokes and do a right hook, go around, fetch 11, bring them back. But I need to keep one of your sections because 10 platoon's not here yet, and I need to protect myself. So I'll keep one of your sections. You go out with 2 sections, that is 20 men, and bring 11 back. Of course, the firefight had been going for an hour now, and 11 was low on ammo, had a lot of casualties and so on. So 12 platoon, my platoon, then took a right flank. We went down to the hut where we knew 11 had been. We went down to the hut and moved in towards 11. So we then struck the enemy that was coming around behind 11. So we sat down and had our firefight on 2 sides, to the north of where 11 was and to the south, because that's where the enemy were coming in. And essentially, we then had to keep the corridor open. We knew where the enemy wasn't. That was where 11 platoon was. So we had to keep the corridor open there. While we were doing that, 10 platoon got back and formed a perimeter around CHQ company. In the process of that movement, we asked for and got a second artillery battery in support of 10 platoon. So they were firing behind the artillery was firing ahead of 10. 10 was retiring behind the artillery. The artillery firing in support of 11 was being manipulated left and right to cover what front line they could see. When I went around, it was obvious that there was a big battle forming now, because this is 2 hours into the battle, and the enemy is still throwing unlimited fire at us, most of it firing high, and there's just more and more people being added to the battle, flanking moves and so on. So they gave me the 3rd artillery battery, and I was then calling the artillery to the south, where I could see movement coming, trying to flank us. So we now had 3 artillery batteries firing in support of us, which is a regimental fire mission, which had not happened since the Korean War, I don't think. And so they were pretty nervous back at base about where this was heading. Logistically, they didn't have that much ammo on.
Yeah.
So they started organising Chinook loads of ammo from Vung Tau and Bien Hoa and so on. But it was getting pretty desperate at that stage.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, me being ex-artillery,
Yeah. That's why
you don't have an endless supply of ammunition,
No.
It's
a little bit more complex.
Not the lightest of things.
Sorry, it's even a little bit more complex than that, because as the artillery installations, what ammo they do have is graded. The artillery, the ammunition that they had fired and found to be absolutely accurate, pinpoint, was in one group. And then there's also untried batches, and they were firing the untried ones because they could afford the 10 or 15 yard differential in the charge.
Yeah.
So they knew that they had this for very close fire support, and they were expending the general purpose ammunition, if you like. I also mentioned that we had 155 artillery in support of us, the American self-propelled 155s, but they had newly arrived and we were not familiar with them. And so we were using them to fire in depth away from us. As it transpired, the 155s are probably arguably more accurate than the 105s, but we were unfamiliar with the piece, and also the fire orders. The American fire orders were different. So that we left them, and they fired in depth, which turned out to be fortuitous because, of course, they landed on the reserve forces, and they had attrition beyond the line of sight. um,
And to be fair, I'd rather have 105mm as danger close because
well,
the area is a
yes,
bit
yeah, the
smaller. It's a bit safer for you.
absolutely. The
Yeah.
smaller round was more controllable. The 155, because of its exponentially bigger bang, and we were unfamiliar with it. As it turned out, we ended up having artillery firing, in some cases, 25 yards away, landing 25 yards in front of our troops, which were on the ground.
Jesus.
And we had 2 cases of wounding from our own artillery, never mind the damage that it was doing beyond that, because the burst range, the lethal radius of a 105 we took to be about 10 or 15 yards. Anything within 10 or 15 yards was gone. So lying on the ground, having a 105 shell land in front of you 25 yards away was scary enough, but it wasn't lethal to us. The 155s, we couldn't have landed within 50 yards of us because of the exponential size of the bang. So that position with 10 platoon protecting the company, 11 platoon still firing out the front, and 12 platoon keeping the corridor open, lasted for another hour, on and off. In that process, of course, we realized we were running low of ammo, so we requested an ammo resupply by chopper. And also we had, the monsoon rain for the day had started during the battle, and we knew that we could call on Phantom jets from Bien Hoa Air Base over by Saigon. They could be overhead in 10 minutes. The Americans had a principle where they had 3 aircraft just flying over Saigon, circling over Saigon, waiting for a call like this. So there was always there, and you call them and they'd be on site 50 miles away in a few minutes. So we called a flight of them in on the principle that if they can come in and they can lay napalm or something in front of 11, that would help us. So we called them in. In order to get them in, we had to stop the artillery for a few minutes, which was bad for us. But once they were overhead, they couldn't identify where we were because we were blacked out from a monsoon. And in the monsoon, it was such a heavy monsoon that it was an electrical monsoon. So there were flashes of lightning everywhere, and of course the flashes of artillery, and they couldn't differentiate where we were. So they ended up laying their cargo about 1,000 yards east where the 155s were dropping. And we could have asked for repeats, but we needed the artillery more. So we called the American Air Force off. We then got to the stage where the ammo was actually resupplied to the company and 10 platoon. And when they threw smoke, because the choppers came in at treetop level, canopy level, so they used smoke to guide them, colored smoke. And so when they threw smoke to guide the choppers, I threw a yellow smoke canister towards 11 platoon so that they could see where we were. Because we were at this stage, we might have been 100, maybe 150 yards away. But we were reluctant to advance because the enemy would have closed in behind us. We were constantly firing to each side at the probes, to stop them from getting behind us. If we had advanced, they would have got behind us. So eventually 11, having lost their radio and restored it, realized that they just couldn't hold on any longer. They had too many casualties. They couldn't even bring all the casualties that they had out with them. They had too few able soldiers to carry all the wounded and dead. So they did a quick canvass, and everyone that wasn't responding was taken to be dead. And so they picked up what they had, 12, 13, 14 men, and pulled back, and they saw the yellow smoke and they came back to us. So we handled the follow-up to them and then withdrew back to company. So then 3 hours into the battle, three hours, the company was now all assembled with 10 platoons wounded, 11 platoons wounded, 10 platoons wounded and a couple dead, 11 platoons wounded that they brought with them, and my wounded. I hadn't had any dead then at that stage either. And we all made it back to company and formed a perimeter. About 6:30, it is now 3 o'clock it started. 6:30, it was going to be dark at 7. Last light was known at that stage to be 7 o'clock, so we had about half an hour to survive. Once the enemy followed us up, followed 11 platoon and 12 platoon back to headquarters, now the enemy knew where we were, and we weren't able to, or we weren't prepared to withdraw any further because we had too many dead and wounded with us. So we just dug in. We just settled. This is where it's going to end. So in that half hour or so, the enemy closed up, and we had then all 3 artillery batteries were then, the control of them were then transferred from the platoon commander to the artillery FO, the forward officer, and he then directed the firing of the 18 guns, and essentially he targeted each of the 6 guns on a different sector and just drew them in, just 10 yards dropping at a time, which is about as close as you can on an artillery piece. One click on the dial represents 10 yards at 5,000 or something, whatever the calibration is on. We were using the Italian mountain guns in those days. We hadn't got the American M1A2, is it?
Pack howitzers.
Yeah, the pack house. I can't remember the designation of them, but the ones we were using were the pack house from Italy. So I don't know what their controls were. Anyway,
I'm not familiar with them ones.
So that was the last half hour of the battle. Essentially, the enemy was desperate. They'd lost lots and lots of people. They were up against this thing that they couldn't just bypass. So they just launched an all-out effort. Fortunately for us, they were spread over a large area and they didn't have comms. They had to send couriers to get their orders out. And we could see while it was still light, we could see teams laying telephone wire out in the bush, in the plantation at a distance. And of course, artillery was chewing them up too. So they weren't able to get their act together. So what they were doing is as soon as they got 20, 30, 40 people, they'd throw them into the firing line. And so they were attacking us in penny packets. The beneficial outcome of that to us was that we were lying there defending, and 30, 40, 50 people would come at us. Artillery was falling. We would have maybe 5 rounds a piece per man in our magazines, because I didn't mention, but when the ammunition was supplied to us, it was supplied in packets, not in magazines. So we had to take the soggy cardboard packets because it was raining, and transfer bullet by bullet into the magazines. If you talk to an old soldier, you remember the 303 had a clip of 5 rounds, and you could open the breech, put the clip in, and just press down, and there's five rounds in your magazine. Not so in the Belgian FN, the SLR. You had to feed them in the magazine one at a time. So we would expend very judiciously what ammunition we had, and then it'd all go quiet. So we had a few minutes then to,
to reload, yeah.
rebuild the magazines, while the enemy was busy finding more troops to put into the line. And by the time that we heard the bugles to, da-da-da, advance, we'd have 5 or 6 rounds in our magazine, so we'd slap it on and, okay, we're ready, we're ready to go again. And that lasted for, 15, 20 minutes, where we were having just human wave attacks coming at us from one angle or another because they weren't coordinated. And so that while we were firing there, 10 platoon around the corner was quiet and loading, and then an assault would come in on them, and we'd have a breathing space. So it was all hectic, but it was working, and that led us to something in the order of about 5 minutes to 7, and it was just bloody dark. The enemy,
I know what's like in the jungle when it's dark. It's dark. You see nothing.
Black.
Yeah.
Black. It was a new moon night, which fed into the idea that they were planning to attack the base. They didn't want moonlight. It was raining heavily, and it was under a rubber plantation canopy, which is very full. So much so, the canopy was so thick that there was no secondary growth underground or on the ground. Usually in a different type of plantation, the sun would get down to the ground and there'd be grass and little bushes, but this was just bare red earth, which didn't help us in the early hours because there was it was dead flat like a billiard table. Nothing for us to hide in, and we didn't have any digging implements, so we were just sitting on the billiard table.
Bloody hell! Yeah.
But then again, that helped us in another way because the rain was pelting down through the canopy so hard that it just came down through the canopy. It was bringing leaves with it. It was dead hard. And after the first half hour or so, of course, the mud on the surface was liquid. And the strength of the raindrops was forming a splash, and we were lying in the splash like a red mist, which helped us. So we were just like lumps of mud shooting the enemy, and they couldn't see where we were. Anyway, it obviously came to the stage where the enemy said, "Look, we're on a hiding to nothing here. Even if we breached their perimeter, it would be hand-to-hand fighting in pitch black, and I'm talking pitch black. You can't see a hand in front of your face." And so they called it off. About 5 minutes to, we started to hear a different bugle call, and and there's no firing incoming, and we started hearing odd shots 100 yards away, further back. Obviously, they were sounding the recall, and they were giving people, come to us, and they were pulling back. Now, in parallel to the last half hour or hour, we had obviously asked for reinforcements. They couldn't land by helicopters. We didn't have the helicopters anyway, but it was in a rubber plantation. We couldn't have landed them. So they had put a company aboard 10 APCs and sent them out from the base. So they had about a 10,000-yard journey to get across some swollen rivers and paddy fields and so on. And they had their own contact a kilometre away from the battlefield, with enemy coming around to get behind us. And then, having fought through that contact, they then had a second contact about 500 yards away from us. This is to the south, where the enemy that they faced were travelling west to east, so they were withdrawing at that stage. So the APCs were on their way, but delayed by lack of orders, rain, swollen paddy, contact. So they were delayed. So they were in the vicinity. They were within 500 yards of us when we started to hear this withdrawal signal. And so they broke contact then, well, they were in the process of a pursuit contact. They broke contact then and reformed and came to us, to 500 yards or so to us in the field, very carefully, because they weren't aware of the position there, and they didn't know exactly where we were, and we weren't showing any lights to tell the enemy where we were. So they edged their way to us, and in the film that you just mentioned earlier before we came on air, we talked about the film Danger Close, and that depicts the APCs coming in with machine guns rattling and so on. Not so. They came in very gingerly, not knowing what to expect and not knowing where we were, with their parking lights on, so that we could see them and we could direct them how to come to us. But it was, by that stage, pitch black. It was just dark. So they came in eventually about 7:10, were directed into a screen around us, or around the leading edge of us, and opened their ramps, and the A Company people came out and took over the perimeter. But there's not a shot fired after dark. And as well as that, there was the original B Company element that had discovered the base plate positions. They were halted on their way back to base, and eventually they were given orders to come back to us. But again, they arrived from the west, which we weren't experiencing fire from, a couple of minutes before 7. So they came in, they arrived, we put them on the perimeter. They didn't fire a shot because the action was on the other side, and it was getting towards no fire time. And about 7:10, everyone was in position, dead silence. We could still hear the odd shot way back in the distance as an assembly point to the enemy, and the battle was over. The guns were stopped to get the APCs in and the other infantry element, and then when they restarted firing from 500 yards away in H&I roll, trying to target withdrawal routes and assembly routes and river crossings and so on. We remained there until midnight, reorganizing ourselves and accounting for the people and so on. They weren't prepared to advance to where the 11 platoon contact had happened and retrieve the bodies there. They didn't want to go. The bosses,
they didn't want to put anyone else in danger.
Well, they decided that we weren't going to go. All the company commanders, by that time there were 3 company commanders on the ground and the APC commander, and they all wanted to go to where 11 was, but they were countermanded by the colonel, who was supported by the task force commander, the brigadier. They said no. Pull back to the clearing where we'd had lunch on the beside the rubber plantation, and we'll call in the choppers and we'll medevac the people that need medevacing, and we'll go in the morning. And so that's what happened. Midnight we got to the clearing, called the choppers in, evacuated the dead that we had with us and the wounded, and they called in a battalion from 5 battalion, a company from 5 battalion, Delta Company 5. They choppered in daylight, and that was swept through the battalion, through the battlefield, to make sure there was no surprises left behind. And then later in the morning, 8 or 9 or 10, we then mounted up the APCs and came in and took over the battlefield and located the 11 platoon position and so on. And so that was the start of about 3 days of remaining on the battlefield and clearing all the debris and gathering in intelligence and so on. And we needed to bury the dead, of course. So our policy was, with enemy dead, we'd bury them as best we could, and we'd record the position so that we could tell the authorities. So we were doing that for the next 2 days. That was we, meaning Delta Company. Even though we'd sustained 1 in 3 was a battle casualty, we had 33% casualties, but we remained on the battlefield for 2.5 days, collecting the intelligence, gathering the weapons, burying the dead, and so on, before we went back to base. The other companies that were out there, the A company that came on the APCs, the Bravo Company element, Delta 5, and ultimately other companies then came out and took up the pursuit and followed up the blood trails and so on. I guess you'd like to know the outcome of the battle, meaning the casualty rates and so on. I've just said that a company of 108 men had 2/3 casualties, or 1/3 casualties, dead and wounded. We don't know how many enemy there were. Intelligence later gathered that there were about 2,000 enemy in the vicinity, not necessarily involved in the battle, but they accounted for that number of units. We buried the bodies that we could identify, and we counted, in the middle of the account, we reached 245 that we could say that's a body. But of course, we'd been surrounded by artillery, and everything that was lying on the ground was chewed to bits. So there was enemy bodies there just disintegrated, vaporized. At the height of the battle, we had 16 artillery pieces firing on high rate of fire for about 20 minutes. And so 16 guns in a small area, that's about a round a second for 16 minutes.
Wow.
Any bodies that we shot were just chewed up by artillery in the nearby. The following forces, the follow-up forces, were coming across temporary graveyards and amputated limbs and so on, by the bucketful, 10s and 20s, mass graves for the first several hundred yards, several thousand yards, and then they petered out. A big operation was mounted at a big level. The Americans came in and the South Vietnamese came in and mounted a big operation subsequent to Long Tan, which tracked them back to their base, 10, 15 Ks away, starting them into their sanctuary areas. But there was no subsequent battle. They basically melted into the greenery. That was the outcome.
I mean, if I can go back a little bit to, you said that you got to about midnight, and that was when you had started to reorg, and the other guys had come and stuff like that. Is that when? I mean, I can imagine the adrenaline had been pumping straight from the first second all the way up until round about then, and then it had just dropped.
Yes.
I mean, what was that like? How were the guys? How did they react to it all?
We were just
once they'd had a time to reflect.
Yeah, the time to reflect was essentially postponed. During the battle, of course, no time to think. After the battle, we had not the benefit of deciding whether we'd done much damage. I mean, we in the front line could see enemy bodies being blown up, but the people, like battalion, just had our report. And so, well, how many bodies did you see? Well, I don't know. There's dozens. Okay, well, we'll put dozens. But we could have said hundreds. That we would have said hundreds. We in the first overnight, we didn't know what to expect. We didn't know whether we'd won the battle or not. We'd certainly been hit. None of our training assumed that the enemy would deliberately attack us. This was counter-revolutionary warfare. We were always going to outnumber them. They were always going to be timid and not want to be found. So if we shot, they ran away. And here, for the first time, we shot and they came. hey, call over the directing staff and say, this isn't fair. We didn't train for this. Not on. So we didn't know whether to think that we'd been kicked in the arse or whether we'd kicked them in the arse. The morning came, and we knew we did our roll calls and so on. We started to put human faces to our losses, and so it was very negative, very, very depressed. Your best mate's dead. Your next best mate's wounded. Well, how am I going to feel good about this? And it wasn't until we got back into the battlefield late morning on the 19th that we saw with our eyes the devastation. A big circle around where we ended up. A big circle was just devastated. The trees were down, the branches were down, the earth was bare, chewed up, pockmarked everywhere, and bits of bodies and enemy equipment and so on, just for hundreds of yards, 100-yard depth and 200 yards wide. And that was just where company was. Then we went to where 10 platoon had their contact, and whilst a lot of the bodies had been cleared away, there were bodies there. Around 11 platoon, the same thing. The APCs went back to where they had their contact, and they saw devastation. And as the other companies went further and further out, they saw the effect of the 155s and the depth fire. I don't know. Can you see the picture behind me there?
Yeah.
That's a picture taken on the 19th with me. That's me leaning up against a rubber tree, and just beyond me you can see an enemy machine gun. And if you look closely at the picture, there's a couple of enemy dead lying beside that. But you can see on the ground the litter of trees and branches. If you cleared that away, that's what it would have been like. And so that the very small trees, very distant and very spaced apart, that was the battlefield. So as we got further and further in, and we saw the devastation there, and we counted the bodies to start with, we realized then that, okay, this had been a very significant victory. Not only serendipity, this was the first time we'd had the first major significant battle for the Australians in the Vietnam War. We'd had contacts with the one battalion that preceded us, had them with the Americans, but we weren't aware of the significance of the battle. We presumed that they were coming to attack the base, but that wasn't really an acceptable political decision, because the politicians would have had to say something like, well, why did the enemy think that they had a chance of attacking the base? Well, because the base was weak. Well, we can't own up to that. We can't own up to the fact that we put a bunch of inexperienced people on a hill in the middle of a war zone and expect them not to be attacked. So a lot of dirty washing was exposed. Over the next several years, it transpired that the VC, or the NVA rather, never again took the Australians on face-to-face. The only significant contacts we had after that, and we did have them, we had more battles with them, but they only occurred where the VC came into the province to do something else. Like during Tet, they wanted to take over Bin Ba and Baria, two towns. So they came in and we resisted them. But they weren't coming in to fight the Australians. They were coming in to do a political job. We ran into them again when we patrolled out towards the edge of the province and into the next province. So they wouldn't come in and fight us within our own province. Or we were operating in an area entirely away from the Australians, and our two next biggest battles were battles of Coral and Balmoral during Tet 68, where the Australians were taken out of Phuc Tuy province, where we were, and put into Bin Hoa province and operating with the Americans. This is the after effects of the Tet Offensive, where the enemy were withdrawing from Saigon. So we took Australian troops and put them in a different province, and the NVA weren't expecting us. So yes, we had big battles there against the NVA, but not the NVA not seeking to specifically attack the Australians. Also, Nui Lee, the next province up, we had another big battle, bunker system and so on. So any time that we dealt with the NVA after Long Tan, it was when they were not expecting us. They didn't want to fight us. They never attacked the base again. They never even threatened the base again. And for the next year or so, even patrol operations took a dip. There just wasn't much enemy activity while the enemy licked their wounds.
Was it true that they had communications to say not to go anywhere near you as well?
Yes, we were taken. When our turn came to leave Vietnam, 2 other battalions came in, 2 RAR and 7 RAR came in and took over from us. 7 AR on one of their very early operations killed a VC courier, and in his pack there was a letter from the Supreme Commander to the unit commanders in the area saying, avoid the Australians. If you come into contact with them, do not contact with them. Do not fight them. Withdraw, and split up and draw. Remember that you're here to win the hearts and minds of the population. You're not here to fight Australians. So keep your wits about you. Do not fight the Australians. Get about your job to fight the South Vietnamese. And so that was the confirmation that we had. Just avoid Australians. And the only place they knew that they would find Australians was in our own province. That's why when they came across the other ones, Coral, Balmoral, for instance, they took a hiding because unfortunately for them, they contacted Australians, and we didn't operate the same way as the Americans or the South Vietnamese. So we constantly surprised them with what we did.
I think that's just good advice for anyone to avoid having a fight with an Australian. To be honest,
we have a good reputation.
Yeah. So the aftermath of all this, then, of the battle and everything like that, how did it affect the troops on the?
Well,
you've gone back to the base and stuff like that.
Sure. The worst side of it was when we came back to base. So after 2.5 days, we'd done a mucky, smelly, yucky job out in the bush, and we came back to base. And the Q store side people had cleared all the possessions of the dead and wounded, or the badly wounded, the ones that were badly wounded enough to go back to Australia. So we came back to our tent lines. At that stage, we had 8-man tents, I think 4 diggers in each. And the diggers came back, and there were empty bunks as a reminder. So, that was a nightmare outside, but here we are. This is reality. And within a few days, we started to get reinforcements, and the reinforcements came in, and they were awkward because their raw troops joining seasoned people that had actually been out there and done things. So they were awkward, and we were awkward because this bloke isn't as well trained as we were. We went through months and months of training in Australia to get to the degree that we were operating under, and so we had to compensate for that. Now, in 11 platoon's case, it was more than half wiped out. So 11 platoon was a complete rebuild, and so they took about a month to fully form, to retrain, to get the structure right, to go back to firing weapons and take just bring us up to standard. They took about a month or 3 weeks plus. 10 platoon had the next number of casualties, and therefore they needed a more reinforcements than I did, and they took about 2 weeks. So they had to bring people in. they were taken off operations to start with, bring them up to standard, do a few patrols, and then get back into it. I had lost only one man dead, but 8 wounded. Of the 8 wounded, I think 4 came back to Australia. So I got 4 back, lightly wounded. And so I had the fewest new recruits. So I was off operations for about a week, my platoon. About a week while I brought them in. I put them under experienced corporals. We brought them up to standard, and we were out doing patrols again after a week. But it was never the same company. There was not the unity of purpose and the identity, and there was always a division between this is a bloke that was the original Delta and this is the replacement. And try as you could, you just couldn't get away from that division. It wasn't a demeaning position. It was just the difference between a rally car driver and a pedestrian driver. Just the experience. He's been there. He's done that. He's proven that he's himself. I haven't. I wish to do that, but I'm just not there yet. And so the early patrols, you're always thinking, who's my forward scout? Is my forward scout one of my recruits who hasn't had the experience? Or do I put one of my originals out as forward scout? That sort of stuff. And it's just natural. You have to defend your own security as best you can. Above that level, of course, Delta Company had proven what has turned out to be a significant battle in the Australian history, in the Anzac tradition and so on. And so we are celebrated for our achievement. And in fact, we got President Johnson gave us a unit citation, which is an award that is reserved for battalion size or aircraft squadrons or ships companies, and yet instead of giving it to the battalion, he gave it only to the company. It's just an enormous honour that is unmatched.
I understand that bit,
yeah, it's unmatched. So, and as we're whittling away our numbers now, the Vietnam veterans themselves honour the Long Tan veterans in a special way.
That's amazing, really, when you think about it. I mean, I know what you mean about the citation. I mean, some of the units I was in a battery that had a VC from the Second World War, and our regiment then was allowed to wear a red backing behind its cipher. So stuff like that is important as well. It's important to the identity of the unit. But to go down to company level and get that, to me, that's quite amazing.
It is, yeah. We had a great deal of problem in our award system in Australia because we were on the imperial system and yet we weren't at war. So for the infantry battalions that were fighting in Vietnam, none of us was allowed to win a VC. It just wasn't on the scale of issue. So despite how great Long Tan ended up, it didn't win a VC for anyone. In fact, the highest award went to the CSM, the company sergeant major, who got a DCM, which is second only to the VC. But that was essentially a political decision made because our scale of awards was warped at the time. We were under the imperial system and yet not at war. You guys fought in the Falklands, for instance, and there was 14 VCs awarded in the Falklands, something in that order. Well, there was some pretty heavy battles in the Falklands, every bit as savage as Long Tan. So the Brits awarded 14 VCs and the Australians awarded none. There's an exception to that argument because 4 of our advisors, we had an advising force in Vietnam, and 4 of them were awarded VCs. But there's a story behind that as well, because they were not part of the military detachment. They were in Vietnam for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade commitments, and so they came through a different system. So it's all explainable, but it ends up in the washing machine as being just loose dirt. Yeah.
How did the thing I found a bit shocking, or not shocking, because I know it has to happen, but and I've had people ask me this question before, who like say, well, who clears up after the battle? I said, well, read it.
Who clears up, yeah.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, how did that affect you? I mean,
job to be done. Part
yeah,
of the deal. You made the mess, you clean it up. We called the engineers to send out a bulldozer because there were so many bodies and parts of bodies and so on. The really cruel part about it is that you've been there on one day shooting these people and happy that you hit someone. The next day, we were in there and we had to clear the pockets of everyone, all the casualties, because we needed the intelligence. In clearing the pockets to get the orders and so on, of course, there were diaries, there were photos in little plastic bags of families, there were mementos, there were press cuttings and so on. So yesterday you were killing him, today you're clearing out his effects, and you're seeing that he's a son and a father and a brother, and all of those little things had to be collected and put to one side to be sent to the intelligence people. So on the 19th, they were human corpses that we had to have a different feeling for, where the day before they'd been enemy soldiers. That hit a lot of people very hard. But the extent of the damage that we caused them caused our damage to shrink, even though I said we had one in 3 of us became a casualty. When we looked at the other side and we saw 100% casualties, yard after yard after yard, that put us into a perspective. And so, yeah, everyone was able to handle that. The whammy came when it became personal, when we got back to base and we saw the empty bunks there. The QSAW people had cleared everything out, and the new people came in. It was just like, turn the page, move on. And that was only 72 days in country, and we had another 9 months to go. So everyone was on tenterhooks saying, well, every time we do a patrol, is this going to be another long tan? 1/3 of us not going to come back home this time too. So that was always a pressure, not just for Delta Company, but for everyone. Everyone saw that this was a company that ran into trouble and did well. Now, what's going to happen next time? So,
the thing is, you've got to kind of put that out of your mind.
You do. You have to get on with it.
You just, I think it's part of your training as well. You don't think about that.
Well,
you don't think every time I go out, someone's going to happen.
Those that can't forget it will fall by the wayside. They'll drop their marbles and just not be able to go out. They'll take to drink. They'll find every excuse not to go. You'll weed those out in the next day, week, month. And we had some of those as well. People that it was just too much shock to the system. They weren't prepared to challenge it, and so we lost a few. In many cases, it was a matter of just transfer them, just take them out of the front line and put them in the Q store, or put them back in the lorry driver down at the base or something. And
was it understood that though? Was it like, I can imagine.
Yes.
I mean, like nowadays, mental health is like really, it's spoke about a lot more and stuff like that. In them days, it wasn't. So when you had someone who reacted like that,
well, that was part of human nature. PTSD wasn't known in those days, or wasn't acknowledged or accepted. But nowadays, it's acknowledged that there's psychological damage to a soldier, not only in the incident, but when he comes home, how he's accepted by his compatriots, his family, and all of those things come into play. But in those days, for better or for worse, it was just, this is happening, we deal with it. How we deal with it? Do we discharge the bloke? Do we transfer him into a non-combat unit? Do we promote him or demote him out of the role and into another role? And whatever it takes to overcome the worry and not spend the soldier. He's still a trained soldier. He's still got something to add. Maybe is he capable of being sent back to Australia and put into a recruit training battalion where he can train recruits? Or is he damaged enough that he will not train a soldier, train another recruit to the degree that we need? Has he got the capacity to overcome his own personal opinion to the stage where he can train someone to do something that he couldn't handle? Those sort of things. It's much more refined now, but we're still talking
Not
about
much more.
we're talking about mid-1900s. What did they do in the mid-1800s?
Yeah.
How many?
So what was not to detract from the battle itself, but like you said, it was only like 70 odd days into it.
Yes.
The rest of your tour, the other 9 months of it, was that a lot quieter?
By comparison with Long Tan, it was on the quiet side.
Yeah.
We just got on with the job. We still had a province to clear, and we had operations to do, and we did them. We, by and large, I think 12 platoon had 12 more contacts. Most of them just the sporadic shot. We killed a few. We had a couple more wounded. But essentially it was, if you look at it from the ups and downs, we got in, we got the big job done, and then it was just frittering away the rest of the time, always on tenterhooks, what can happen next. But that just enhances or sharpens your training. 11 platoon, the one that was most decimated and therefore built from recruits, later in the tour made another bad mistake and got hit by a claymore mine for doing the wrong thing and got another 10 casualties killed because... Sorry?
So bloody hell.
Well, yeah. But you can see the cause and effect. They weren't as well trained as the rest of the platoon, the company. They made an elementary mistake. There was a creek to cross and a bridge, and they were clearing either side of the bridge, and it was wet. And my platoon was in the bush to the left, 10 platoon was in the bush to the right, and 11 platoon had the clearing of the road and the clearing of the road. And they came towards it, and for reasons unknown to us, the first section went across the bridge and deployed on the other side, and the other two, instead of wading through the creek and coming up the other side, decided to come onto the road, go across the bridge, and spread out again. Well, when the two of them came onto the bridge, the enemy let off a command-detonated mine. So cleaned out, killed and wounded two sections, and essentially bad training. Why? Because they were recruits who hadn't gone through the big training session that they should have had. So they hit you can say bad luck, but they hit misfortune a second time. 10 platoon had a similar experience to us. They got through the rest of the platoon, rest of the year relatively unscathed. I would imagine that the average infantry platoon in Vietnam over a year might have had maybe 10, 12, 15 contacts, all small scale of some description, other than the ones that had those big incidents that I called. And in some cases where we took someone by surprise in a camp, and so we assaulted the camp, we took casualties there, of course. But by and large, artillery helped us out most of the time. We came to rely on artillery as our clearing mechanism. And after I came back, we sent over a squadron of tanks as well. So we had Centurions over there, which were operating with the infantry. So that helped. That helped us again. Many of our casualties came from booby traps and mines. And to our dishonour, many of those were picked up from a minefield that was inadvisedly laid in the last days that we were there. My battalion was there. So we laid a big barrier minefield, which was never going to be covered or patrolled. And so the enemy came in and lifted those mines and then laid booby traps for us. So a lot of our casualties came from that strategic mistake. And again, no one was answered. Yeah. It's a scandal in the Australian Army which has never been addressed. But that's exposing the dirty underwear.
Yeah, just a bit. So what was it like coming on then? I mean, you see, in like movies and stuff like that, in America, everyone was against the Vietnam War and stuff like that. Did you ever experience any of that?
Yes and no. In the days when I was there, the war, never to say it was popular, but it was accepted. In the 65, 66, even 67, it was accepted. This is a job we have to do. It's a dirty job. No one likes to do it, but it's part of our international commitments, and so we'll do it. And much the same happened in America. They were fairly much gung ho. You didn't hear the mainline protests. You heard the feminist movements and don't conscript my son and so on. But the changing point came in Tet, which is a February lunar festival in the Southeast Asia of 68. In Tet 68, the enemy command structure, the NVA, held a countrywide uprising, wishing that if they could just get everyone all together and attack all the villages and all the protection units and so on at once, that the whole country would then come to the side. They'd all come to Jesus and get behind Ho Chi Minh, and the war would be won. Well, what happened is that all of the American journalists who up until that stage had been living a pretty good life in the hotels in Saigon and having their gin and tonics at 5 o'clock, woke up one morning to find bullets coming in their windows. And they all basically, to a man and to a woman, took fright and said, geez, if they can do that, if they can fire a bullet in my window, then we're not winning the war, and therefore we must be losing the war, and therefore, it's all lost, it's all gone, or it's no good being here. And pretty much to an outlet, they all flipped. This is a hopeless war. This is terrible. Save our sons. It's all over. Anti-war. Even the veterans from the war that had already returned joined in and said, no more, no more. And you had the Kent State University riots and so on. So up until February 78, it was a worthwhile war to be fighting. But after 68, it became an indefensible war. We're not winning. We're just expending money. The CIA behind the scenes is involved in drug trafficking and so on. We're not in this for fair dinkum reasons. Let's call it quits. And from there, it just fizzled out to an inglorious end. At home, when we came home, we came back to a ticker tape parade in Brisbane because we were a Brisbane outfit. People lined the streets, 6, 7, 8 deep, and telephone books shredded, showered down from the heavens, and we were just wonderful. The new Anzacs. And it wasn't until February 68 and we started getting people violently opposed to the war, and were accused of raping babies and killing mums, and and so everyone hated us, and it was trendy to hate. And so the soldier started saying, well, what's in it for us? Nobody likes us. We come home, we can't own up to having been in Vietnam because we'll be labelled baby rapers. Forget it. And the army then, in its wisdom, said, well, when we bring you home, we're going to bring you home by plane to an airport, a regional airport, middle of the night. Don't wear uniforms. We'll bus you to your barracks, put on your civilians, and go home. Don't mention that you've been to the war, and it'll all go away. And that's the trend of the end of the war. That was where all the moratoriums and the demonstrations happened. So it left a very unpleasant flavour in the mouth. And it's only recently been an attempt to reverse it by this trend in America, for instance, of every time you meet a soldier, you say, thank you for your service, that sort of stuff. And most of the people that they're thanking didn't have any service anyway, certainly not in Vietnam. It's much more recent than that. But the same sentiment then flowed through to subsequent wars. And they were found to be baseless wars, like the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and Afghanistan. They went back in there, despite every British expedition into Afghanistan has withdrawn with its tail between its legs. Never learned.
Literally everyone who's gone to Afghanistan.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the Russians.
I mean, I know what you're saying about the consequent, the wars afterwards, like Iraq,
Yes.
2003. Yes, I agree. It was probably an illegal war. Went in on the wrong pretensions. And I was there. I went in on that one. I was in that, and I've mentioned it in previous podcasts to other people, and we've discussed it. But probably the same as yourself, whether you agreed with it or not, and whether it was illegal or not, we were there to do our job.
That's right.
And we were still very, very proud of what we did.
Yes.
Because you go there and you do. There's nothing better. It's a weird feeling that you end up doing something you're trained to do. And I mean, I joined 1985, and in the middle of the Cold War, not the middle of the Cold War, towards the end of the Cold War, and there was nothing happening. It was just we were just in Germany getting drunk all the time. It's great. But then things started happening. Bosnia kicked off. We were going to Northern Ireland and things like that. And then Iraq and Afghanistan come along, and it was all very different. But once you get to do your job, what you've trained for years for, there's no going back from that. I can't. And for a lot of people, they left after that. They left the army because where else? Where are you going to go from that? But you're still very proud of what you did, and you're the guys that you work with, and it's not.
Oh yes.
You're not doing it for the government and stuff like that. Like you were there with your guys, and it's them that you think about and that you fight for. You're fighting for your mates, not the government.
The elected government decided on conscription, and the public supported it. So, what do they expect? If the public has said, yes, government, call up soldiers, yes, train them, yes, we'll go to Vietnam, but I'm not responsible for what they do when they're there, but I'm responsible for having them and having them trained and being prepared and so on. So the buck stops there. I disown them now. They did what the country asked for, but no, I don't like it. That's a luxury that you can have so long as you only have a blinkered view of the world. If you have a view of the world that says, well, no, I don't want to get involved in any war ever again, then you've got to change your whole approach to your own society. Do you really want to be a diverse, inclusive society? If you say yes to that, then you're going to wear the consequences. If you're not, if you want your society where you think it's perfect and you want to exclude the rat bags, then be prepared. Be prepared for what you ask for. There's also another thing about a side effect is that the things that you learn in the army that you don't learn outside the army are invaluable to the rest of your civil life, your occupation. You learn punctuality and self-discipline. You realize what your limits are and your strengths. You learn how to get on with other people, whether you like them or not. You learn to accept and make the best use of what you can get. If you're given options, you learn the choices to make and so on. And these are all things that every soldier that I've ever known, whether they liked the army or not, once they got out, they employed the things that the skills that they learned to their advantage in their civil life, in their occupations. And I certainly did myself.
So when you come back at the end of your national service, did you not think of staying in and joining up as a
Oh
regular?
yes, I was pressured to stay in it, but I had seen enough of the internal workings over the things that I had witnessed, the attitudes to awards, the ability for senior commanders to disown what happened under their command. Like I mentioned, the sowing of that minefield. Even my corporals said that's a mistake. You can't do that. It'll backfire on us. And yet a brigadier not only did it, but he got an OBE for it, or DSM, I think it was, whatever it was, and was never brought to account. Those sort of things. And I realized that the army as an establishment was not a good place to be. You had to compromise too much of your own intellect or values in order to be part of that machine. You know, they always came to you and said, "Look, in the army, you're just a cog in a machine. You blend in and you work with others." And I would be prone to say, yes, but if you're a cog in the machine, some of you are going in the opposite direction. In order for it to work, some of you need to do the reverse of what other people are doing, and that argument never went down at all. No, I was quite happy. I was newly married. I just married before I went to Vietnam, knowing that I was going, and I wanted to start a family and a job. I was not entirely happy with my job at the time, but computers were coming into the world, and I was very interested in computers and the logical approach to things. So I was keen to learn about this new computers. Back in the 60s, of course, they were just big mainframes in air-conditioned rooms. They weren't little laptops and telephones and wristwatches and so on. So getting in on the ground floor of that and learning programming and project management, more to my point, was more interesting to me than joining the army, where in the Australian army, as distinct from the British army, when you join a unit, you stay with the unit, and the unit stays where it is or gets posted at the government's whim. Whereas in the UK, you join a regional unit and you're there for life, basically. The Lancashire Rifles or the whatever. And so if you join the army, you have an established or a stable life. In the Australian army, you ran the risk of reposting to some outlandish place every 3 years. If you took promotion, you were going to be moved to a different unit, and that meant upheaval to the wife and the household. Your kids weren't going to get a good, consistent education and so on. And all those things appealed to me more at the time than becoming a cog in a big machine. So I didn't accept their invitation.
Fair enough. It's not for, like you say, it's not for everybody, and you had perfectly good reasons not. And you've done your stint, you've done your duty, as I say.
Say again?
So there's no need. You've done your duty. There's no point in carrying on with it.
Oh yes, yeah. Get in there, do the job, and get out. Let someone else carry on. Yeah.
Right, David. Thanks for coming on and telling us your story. I've been enthralled with it. And I know there's probably lots of pockets of it I've never not asked you about and everything, stuff like that. It's been an honour really to have you on and speak to you about it.
No problem.
It really has been.
If you get queries from other people, or if you have other questions, we'll do a follow-on session. No, what?
Yeah. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was your books that you've written.
The books.
Yeah.
In the late 90s, it became the subject of why Long Tan happened came to the fore for some reason, and it was generally accepted that we Delta Company had walked into an ambush. How could it be otherwise? And I said, no, it wasn't an ambush, and I laid my reasons out, and I did a presentation to the Australian War Memorial and so on. And essentially, enough people said, oh, well, I didn't think about that, that I thought, well, I need to get this out further. So I wanted to write a book about the battle, but Vietnam was closed to the public, to the West in those days, and no one would talk. Besides which, most of the NVA soldiers had long since died in the war, because their war went on for many more years. So I opted to write what's called a faction novel. That is, everything that happens is true, but I can't say General such and such did this and General such and such did that, and I can't even give a background to him because it's all unknown. So I manufactured the enemy units and placed them in a position where they did what really happened. And I published that book, and it's called Through Enemy Eyes, and I published that in 2005, and it went over very well. It became a bestseller in Australia, which is not a high hurdle, with only 5 or 6 million people in those days. And that book has since gone out of print, but that was my first writing effort. But while I was in Vietnam, I wrote home daily in the form of a diary. And I was writing to my wife and to her father. My wife wanted to know all the itsy bitsy emotional stuff and what I'm going through, what I'm thinking. And her father was a CSM during the Second World War, and he was interested in the tactics and the strategy and the weapons and in what way does an SLR differ from a 303 and so on, all the nitty gritty stuff. So I'm covering both of those in my letters. And I asked them to store them. Also, I sent the expired intelligence reports home, which I used in the construction of the Through Enemy Eyes book. Then recently, or a few years back, someone said, well, Long Tan was one pretty hectic day in your tour. What about the other 365 days? And I thought, well, true, no one's ever written about that. What does a soldier do on deployment? What goes through his mind? What's important to him when he's not in a pitched battle? And so I retrieved and transcribed all those letters, and I cut out all the excessively mushy stuff, and I added in the background stuff that they already knew, that the reader wouldn't know, and I put it together in a diary form. This is day by day. What happened to this platoon commander for a year in Vietnam, and I took it to a publisher and said, this is what I want to do. Of course, they said, well, we'll sell 5.5 books and we're not interested, thank you. So I self-published that, highly pictorial, because of a deal that I made with the Australian War Memorial. So there's lots and lots of photos and maps and so on in it. But essentially, it is what I experienced each day, almost every day, of a year tour of duty. And I published that under the name of Mentions in Dispatches, because the dispatches were the letters, and this is what I mentioned in all the dispatches. And I published that. And I self-published about 2,000 copies, of which about 1,000 have sold, which is par for the course. That's about what I would have expected from the vet community, the people that wanted to know but didn't actually do it themselves. So that book is now available. I'll give you a website. anyone that wants to look at it, www.sabbenmidbook, Saben MID book, one word, .com. And there they can see a preview of the book, they can read what's in it, they can order it, they can pay by EFT or by card. All I want from them is an address to post it to, and I'll write in front of it, something what they want. They tell me what they'd like me to write, and I'll write something, and I'll send it. The downfall is that it's an expensive coffee table type book, A4 format. It's a fairly hefty sort of volume, A4 size and 400 pages, 2 kgs, and the production, great production of it, but that makes it expensive. So it's $82 Australian, and to get it to UK, unfortunately, the post office wants $60 more, so it makes it an expensive proposition. Apologies.
Well, we'll put the link for that in the show notes when I put the podcast out as well.
Very nice.
So you never know. You might get one or two more.
Oh, well.
People want to buy from over here. Hopefully, fingers crossed.
I'll be happy to.
Right. It's been just over 2 hours now, so
yep.
I don't want to take up any more of your time, and it's getting late here.
No worries.
Honestly, thank you for coming on. I've really, really enjoyed it. It's such a story. And hearing it from your side, and then, a lot of people, I know guys in the artillery know about the Battle of Longtan because of the way you directed artillery, and it's quite famous. And it shows the power of artillery. A few years ago, people were saying that I don't need it anymore, and then Ukraine happened, and it's obviously you do need artillery. You can't win a war without artillery, unfortunately.
Absolutely.
It's just the way it is, and we get called drop shorts and all sorts of things like that. But, that's just banter and stuff. But it just shows you that different units working together are an army, and they do win battles because of that. Your expertise in bringing in the danger close missions and stuff like that, and the forward observers that were there doing it and everything.
Yep.
It just shows you a close knit community or a company
and
like that, and undefeatable.
Interreliability of it, and the trust.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Then I'll end the recording here. And honestly, like I said before, really, thanks for coming on. It's been fantastic.
No problem. Thank you for the work that you're doing in the area, and it's my pleasure.
Right. Yeah. I hope you enjoyed that podcast. I enjoyed recording it. If you could just hit the like button, and also if you could subscribe and hit the notification bell, that'd be great, because it'll help the channel grow. The more people will see it, the bigger it'll get, and the more guests I can get on, and the more people I can talk to. Well, I hope you enjoyed it, like I said. Look forward to the next one. Hopefully we'll be out next week as normal. Bye-bye now.